So it's been just a phenomenal project. And that's the kind of stuff that gets me very excited. And eventually it will be able to do some really cool stuff with smart contracts and hopefully cross-chain bridging as well, especially when we talk about other networks. And it's relatively cheap to develop this software. So it is a humongous step forward. Well, I think there was this bizarre belief that people had that Hydra was going to be this magic technology that was the end-all be-all of scaling. And we never presented it that way. And we never said that Hydra was going to be this technology that suddenly we'd flip a switch and magically the network performs 1,000 times faster than everybody else. You know, Hydra enables you to take certain types of traffic, like micropayments, voting, DEX transactions, these types of things, and run a lot of them off-chain. And so it simulates running thousands of transactions off-chain and batching them together and really reduces your cost and increases your throughput. So for certain things, let's like a tip application or a voting application or a DEX, it really can have a huge impact on your operating cost and finality and these types of things. But it's not a one-click thing that you drop in and you say, suddenly Hydra's here, and now we're faster than everybody else, and the story's over. There's always a lot more to it, like the data availability side, the storage side. There's a lot of issues with complex transactions. There's a privacy consideration, a solution for scaling Cardano. We have input endorsers. You know, we have a roll-up strategy. You know, we have a strategy for side chains, and all of these together is what gets you that scale as a network, end to end. And Hydra is a very important component because it can be integrated as middleware into dApps, and it's moving very quickly. But it's not the only component in the scaling story or solution. It's an important one, though. So Hydra is part of the TPS story, as is extended UTXO, as is improvements to Plutus, you know, as is side chains, as is input endorsers, all of these things. And every time you bring something online, some things are big, like input endorsers. That's like the fusion. And other things are like community distributed stuff, and that's kind of like Hydra, where it's like solar, where, you know, if you have that resource, you can put some panels on your roof. In other words, a dApp can integrate Hydra, and that generates you know, a little bit of electricity. In other words, it reduces their throughput requirements, but they have the same operating model, if that makes sense. Yeah, it's a dApp by dApp thing. So where and when you can integrate it, your operating cost of your dApp will go down tremendously, because what happens is that you are posting less transactions on chain and more of your stuff is being done through a Hydra head. So if you required, you know, a certain amount of resources, let's say 5 transactions per second, maybe now you're down to 0.5 transactions per second. So effectively you've gotten a 10x in your operating cost and throughput because you're running a lot of things off chain. And so this actually saves resource consumption for Cardano. So it is a humongous step forward where and when it works. Like, let's say that you have an application and you're building like, you know, Crypto Crow's Twitter, and you want to have a change tip capability where people, you know, if they like your tweets or like your videos, they click a button to tip you 0.001 ADA. You can't really do that on a main chain because the cost would be quite prohibitive, but you could do that in a Hydra sense, and you could process every day millions to billions of tips. You see, and so that's just something specific to your application, but now your application is able to run on Cardano guarantees. So where and when it works, it's quite transformational. That's why I like the energy analogy. If you happen to live next to a volcano, you got a fuck ton of geothermal, and you're going to have unlimited energy. Look at Iceland, for example, where they can process aluminum and grow bananas and all these types of things. But you know, if you don't live next to geothermal, you can't really do much with that energy modality. So if you have a type of application that would benefit from Hydra, you might win the lottery, and all of a sudden you're 100 times faster, your operating cost is substantially lower. But if you have a type of application that doesn't really use that transaction pattern, you're going to have to use a different scaling solution, like input endorsers or build a side chain or use a roll-up or, you know, these types of things, if that makes sense. I think that probably one of the nicest parts is that Hydra is a good finality solution. So when things happen in a Hydra channel, they happen near instantly. So like when you're spending from your wallet, you're doing a transaction, if that's Hydra enabled, like what Load Wallet is trying to do or any of these other guys, it just settles. It's just one click and it's there. Another really cool thing is that the software is getting better, much faster, and it's already on mainnet, and it's an open source project. So as more people develop on it, it's almost like having a free piggyback collection of mini protocols, and eventually it will be able to do some really cool stuff with smart contracts and hopefully cross-chain bridging as well, especially when we talk about other networks, like bridging Cardano to Litecoin or Cardano to Bitcoin or Cardano to any other UTXO system or account-based system. So it's one of those things where if you look at one direction, you get super excited because you say, wow, this is a self-evolving technology that every dApp developer now has, like they have Marlowe or all this other stuff, and where and when it works, it's great for them. And the places where it works increase over time, and it's relatively cheap to develop this software. The Hydra team is quite small. It's only a few developers, and there's already in the open source meetings like 40, 50 people showing up regularly. So it's been just a phenomenal project, when you look at the history of it, relative to resources that are put in. And that's the kind of stuff that gets me very excited. It's like a community-driven open source project of middleware that dApp developers can use to make their dApps faster, cheaper, and better, or wallet developers can use to add fast finality to their wallets and lower transaction fees in the wallets. Similar to how Lightning gets integrated into Bitcoin wallets, if you're familiar with that. So let's say you're playing a poker game. It would be really bad if your naive implementation of a poker game is that every time you play a hand, every time you shuffle, every time a player bets, that's a transaction on chain. Rather, what you'd want to have happen is that people lock their funds, they go and play the game off chain, but then the system has the ability to preserve the integrity of the game. So that there's no fake cards, that it's a fair shuffle, and also when you win or lose, when you go to withdraw your funds, that's reflected. So this model could be reused again and again for pretty much anything. Let's say you're playing like Warhammer, the digitized version of desktop Warhammer. There's a ton of events and logic that are happening here. Any video game is going to have this. And what you want to have happen is that it's a fair game. You get a guarantee that no one can cheat. You get a guarantee you're playing against, let's say, humans, these types of things. And you can run all of that logic in a Hydra head. And then you just have an entry and exit point for when people quit the game and leave for the state to reset. And that's the batch transaction that they pay for. And it's relatively lightweight, proportionate to all the things that can happen. So we're real excited about this for introduction of NFT elements into games, microtransactions into games, tipping into games, and also just identities into games like DIDs, and try to run a lot of that stuff off chain. And they use Hydra basically to be that bridge. But a lot of times with games, they're what we call Web 2.5. So basically, they're kind of like a cryptocurrency, but they're centralized components because you have the game developer, you have servers, you have all of these other things. And so what basically this allows you to do is to sort out the centralized parts from the decentralized parts, and it gives you a bridging mechanism to connect those two things. I think that's the other part of Hydra that's most exciting, is this idea that you have some connecting tissue to make it easier to connect a web client model, like what Diablo 4 is doing or an MMORPG is doing or these other things, to a crypto model, and they just kind of plug together. Hydra gives you kind of the fast transaction component, the low-cost transaction component to move assets around. Those assets can be Ada, those assets can be your own stable coin you've issued, those assets can be NFTs, et cetera, et cetera. I think a lot of NFT transactions will also occur in Hydra heads over time. So it turns out that Marlowe is actually a perfect language for a AI agent, an LLM, like GPT or Bard, to actually generate code. And the reason being is that you can use SAT solvers in the prompt engineering and other things, and it's a Turing incomplete language, so it means you can verify every single execution trace. So assuming that the model doesn't run out of tokens, so it's really nice to have a Turing incomplete DSL like Marlowe, and I feel that that's going to be very transformative. Because what happens is once you start connecting that to asset issuance and some light Plutus code, you can have it like a sparring partner. So you could sit as a non-technical person, some time in the future, like a year or 2 years, as this technology continues to grow, and you could say things like, hey, I really want to make a video game on Cardano, or I really want to do, XYZ on Cardano, and say, hey, write some code for me and do this thing, and let's test it. And you can go back and forth and play around with it. And basically, the GPT acts as the programmer. But the other cool part about Marlowe is it showed everybody in Cardano land basically how to design DSLs, domain-specific languages. And because that framework's there, it means more will come, like the Aikens of the world, or potentially legal languages like open law that can be brought into the platform to basically handle contract rights, intellectual property, and these other things. So it's really exciting to bring this to bear, and we're definitely looking at it. I'm even going to an AI conference in Las Vegas in August to kind of meet with all the big guys in AI, and we're definitely tracking how do we integrate generative AI into our product portfolio. And Marlowe was one of the first that we identified we think would do real well with generative AI and LLMs. Midnight is kind of the leader in the sidechain builder framework. And so there's two teams. There's the sidechains team and the Midnight team. They're technically independent, but they're jointly working together on a project. It's kind of like when IBM and Boeing work with NASA to go get it or something like that. So what the sidechains team is doing is they're constructing a sidechains framework so that anybody who wants to build sidechains for Cardano, it's very easy to do. Systems like Cosmos or for Polkadot, Cosmos has a framework, Polkadot has parity substrate, and basically Cardano is going to get a framework like that. And Cosmos and Polkadot, they have chain builder frameworks, and what we're doing is there's a sidechain team in Cardano building a sidechain work, and anybody who wants to build a sidechain, let's say for a video game or for World Mobile, for telco, or for Midnight, that's the framework that they're going to build on top of. And there's a lot of really cool technologies that we're bringing into that. Now, Midnight is kind of the first major customer, and so that's an independent development team, and they're meaning it's a different leadership structure. I run both, but they're different developers, different engineers, and they're building on top of that same sidechain framework to bring Midnight, launch it to the Cardano ecosystem. Now, what will happen is at a later date, we'll kind of discuss a bit about the tokenomics and how that distribution works. But in general, on the sidechain side, what we want to accomplish is that people pay their transaction fees, and they pay they pay inflation, I should say. The maintenance of their sidechain to the ADA holders.